Before the Berlin Wall fell, before Gorbachev announced the end, before the hammer and sickle came down from the Kremlin, the Soviet Union had already lost the war that mattered most. Not the Cold War fought with missiles and spies. The economic war? The quiet, grinding collapse of a system that promised equality but delivered stagnation, that claimed to represent the workers but couldn't put bread on their shelves. The Soviet Union didn't fall because of Reagan or revolutions. It fell because its economic architecture was built on a foundation that couldn't support its own weight. Welcome to the Money Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. In 1945, the Soviet Union stood as one of two global superpowers. It had defeated Nazi Germany, occupied half of Europe, and was rapidly industrializing. Stalin's 5-year plans had transformed a peasant society into an industrial giant in just 2 decades. Soviet tanks, Soviet steel, Soviet engineering, the world took it seriously. By the 1950s and 60s, the USSR was launching satellites, building nuclear weapons, and projecting power across the globe. Khrushchev famously told the West, "We will bury you," and it didn't sound like empty boasting. The Soviet economy was growing faster than America's, or so the statistics claimed. But those statistics were lies. Not small lies, not exaggerations, foundational lies that hit a system already beginning to rot from the inside. Because central planning, the core of Soviet economic theory, had a fatal flaw. It couldn't calculate value. In a market economy, prices communicate information. When demand for something rises, prices go up, signaling producers to make more. When something becomes abundant, prices fall, signaling producers to shift resources elsewhere. It's not perfect, but it works because millions of individual decisions create a feedback loop. The Soviet Union tried to replace that entire system with bureaucrats in Moscow making production quotas for everything from steel to shoes to bread. The results were predictable and absurd. Factories received quotas measured by weight, so they made the heaviest possible products. Massive chandeliers? Nobody wanted. Industrial nails so large they were useless. Clothing factories met their quotas in meters of fabric, but produced sizes nobody could wear. Farms hit their grain quotas but left it rotting in fields because there were no trucks to transport it. And the truck factories hit their quotas but didn't have tires. The entire economy was a Kafkaesque maze of production, divorced from consumption, where everyone was making things nobody needed while the things people actually wanted didn't exist. And it got worse. Because Soviet planners knew their system was inefficient, they poured resources into heavy industry, steel, coal, oil, military equipment, while neglecting consumer goods. The theory was simple. Build the industrial base first, consumer goods later, except later never came. Decades passed and Soviet citizens still couldn't reliably buy meat, or soap, or toilet paper. The state could launch rockets into space but couldn't manufacture a decent refrigerator. Empty shelves became the defining image of Soviet life. People spent hours every day standing in lines, not knowing what they were queuing for until they reached the front. The joke went, "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us." By the 1970s, the Soviet economy had stopped growing. Not officially, official statistics still showed growth. But in reality, productivity was stagnant. The only thing keeping the system afloat was oil. When global oil prices spiked in the 1970s, Soviet oil exports brought in hard currency, masking the underlying decay. The Kremlin used that money to buy grain from the West. Yes, the agricultural superpower had to import food, and to subsidize the economies of its satellite states in Eastern Europe, which were even more dysfunctional than its own. Then came the 1980s. Oil prices collapsed. Suddenly, the Soviet Union's primary source of hard currency disappeared. The Afghan War was draining resources. The arms race with the United States was unsustainable. Reagan's military buildup forced the Soviets to spend more and more on defense, money they didn't have. The entire Eastern Bloc was an economic drain, requiring constant subsidies to prevent collapse. And back home, the infrastructure was crumbling. Factories used technology from the 1950s. Roads were falling apart. The healthcare system was failing. Life expectancy actually started declining, something almost unheard of in peacetime. And then there was Chernobyl. In 1986, the nuclear disaster didn't just kill people and contaminate land. It revealed the systemic incompetence and corruption of the Soviet state. The reactor exploded because of cost-cutting, poor design, and bureaucrats ignoring safety protocols to meet quotas. The government lied about it for days while radiation spread across Europe. Chernobyl became a metaphor for the entire system, a facade of technological achievement hiding catastrophic dysfunction underneath. Gorbachev tried to fix it. He introduced glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring. The idea was to modernize the Soviet economy without abandoning socialism. But you can't partially reform a command economy. The moment you introduce market elements, the contradictions become impossible to hide. Prices that were artificially fixed for decades suddenly had to reflect reality, causing inflation. State-owned industries that had operated at a loss for years suddenly faced competition and collapsed. Corruption that had been hidden became visible, and once people could speak freely, they said what everyone already knew. The system didn't work. It had never worked. By 1989, the Eastern European satellite states were breaking away. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, one by one, they abandoned Soviet control. The Kremlin didn't send tanks this time because it couldn't afford to. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself was disintegrating. Not because of invasion, not because of revolution, but because it was economically bankrupt. The state couldn't pay its bills, couldn't feed its people, couldn't maintain basic services. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. 74 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, the experiment was over. The collapse of the Soviet economy was unto a single event. It was the inevitable result of fundamental contradictions. You cannot run a complex modern economy through centralized planning. The information problem is unsolvable. You cannot sustain growth by building factories to build more factories while ignoring what people actually need. You cannot compete in a global economy while isolating yourself from market forces. And you cannot maintain legitimacy when the gap between propaganda and reality becomes impossible to ignore. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Every warning sign was visible decades before the collapse. Western economists knew. Soviet dissidents knew. Ordinary Soviet citizens definitely knew. But the system couldn't reform itself because the people in power benefited from the status quo. The Communist Party elite lived like capitalist oligarchs while preaching equality. The military-industrial complex consumed resources regardless of economic reality. The bureaucracy existed to perpetuate itself. When you build a system where honesty is punished and failure is rewarded as long as you meet arbitrary quotas, you get exactly what the Soviet Union became, a hollow shell pretending to be a superpower. And the lesson resonates today because command economies haven't disappeared, they've just evolved. Modern authoritarians still believe they can control markets, manipulate prices, and direct economies through state power. China's state capitalism is a hybrid model, mixing market mechanisms with political control. But the fundamental tension remains. Can you have economic efficiency without economic freedom? Can you have innovation without competition? Can you have prosperity when the state decides winners and losers? The Soviet Union answered those questions definitively. The answer was no. So what killed the Soviet economy? Not capitalism, not the West, not even communism as an ideology. What killed it was the arrogance of believing you could replace millions of individual decisions with a committee in Moscow. The hubris of thinking you could engineer human behavior and economic outcomes through central planning. The delusion that statistics on paper mattered more than bread on shelves. The Soviet Union fell because economic reality doesn't care about your ideology. It doesn't negotiate, it doesn't compromise. And when you ignore it long enough, it crushes you. If this changed how you see the world, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.